Hey there, Fourth Trimester listeners. Our program today is proudly sponsored by Family Album, your secure haven for sharing baby photos and videos. Head over to the App Store today, search Family Album, one word, download the app, and start creating a legacy of love, one photo at a time. Hi, I'm Sarah Trott, and welcome to the Fourth Trimester Podcast. I'm a new mama, and this podcast is all about postpartum care for the first few months following birth, the time period also known as the fourth trimester. My postpartum doula, Esther Gallagher, is my co-host. She's a mother, grandmother, perinatal educator, birth and postpartum care provider. Fourth trimester care, our topic, is about the practical, emotional, and social support parents and baby require. And importantly, it helps set the tone for the continuing journey of parenting.
Hello again, listeners. It's Esther Gallagher this time, and Sarah is not with us today, sadly, but we have a wonderful guest again. Our guest today is Emily Flynn, and we're calling this show How Doulas Work with Contracts. And we're going to talk about what's good about working with a contract. Emily is just the gal to tell us about it. So, Emily, I would love it if you could start by telling us what brought you to doula work, and then we'll really just launch right into the whole contract.
Great.
Subject.
Thanks, Esther. Thanks for having me. Hi, everybody. I got into doula work through two roundabout ways that kind of cross paths eventually. First is just that I am from a giant family back east, and so pregnancy and babies was always a huge part of my life, and I knew my birth story and my siblings' birth stories my whole life, and my family are good storytellers, so they were always dramatic and silly and fun, and it's always been in the back of my head. And then I read the book Midwives with my mother during a mother-daughter book club when I was 14, and somehow had this vision of myself as a grandmother catching my grandbabies in a barn as a midwife. Don't really know how that popped in my head. But I pushed it back and went about, finishing high school, and in college I studied very dry international law. And I really enjoy the dry language of law and the research. So then I set about being a legal researcher for nonprofits in the U.S. and abroad. And I was working mostly on issues around refugees and migrant persons. And
wow, there's a timely subject.
Exactly. Yes. Lots in the news is my head's buzzing with old papers that I wrote and how it's still the same problems now as before.
And always.
And always, yes. And most refugees and migrant persons are women and children. And so I kept being funneled more into that aspect because I was really focused on trying to be as useful as possible in the work that I was doing. And so when I was in Holland, I got a chance to hang out with the midwives who run the International Confederation of Midwives. We shared a office hangout tea space I wasn't there for very long. But I started thinking about birth work again, came to the U.S., was still back east for a little bit, was trained in New York, and then I moved out west with a partner, and I've kind of been here and there and about doing doula work, still doing legal research for nonprofits around midwifery care and hospital policies and access to care when I can, but for the most part, just doing doula work, and have been doing it for about 9 years.
Wow. That's great story. I love that story. I always love listening to stories and hearing where my story overlaps and doesn't. You know, it's like, oh, and that took you in that direction, took me in this direction, and back around to the same thing. That's so interesting and lovely. Thanks for sharing it. So you have a particularly interesting, I was thinking, Emily, how, you know, you came from this luxurious linguistic family, you know, just verbal and storytelling. And then you said, and I love the dry language of the law. And I thought, well, there's a balancing, an interesting balancing place, right? Yeah. That we all have to find sort of, or do, you know, maybe do find. And I was also thinking how, you know, birth and postpartum recovery, they're such a time for the parents of kind of being, in a metaphorical sense, kind of blown up, you know, and every bit of whatever kind of language they're used to may or may not be something that helps them in that process. But I was also thinking how important it is as they're going, you know, as they're in the pregnancy and postpartum journey, that if they're going to have help and support, that's a help and support that's grounded and clear and descriptive. And that, you know, doulas need to hold that piece. So it's lovely to have your story and your orientation. So, let's talk a little bit about how doulas in general, but doulas vis-a-vis clients, potential clients, can do this piece together.
The contract piece? Yeah. So I had a roommate in college who, she's in the art world, and I was doing my legal stuff, and I was talking at one point about this conversation I was a part of when I worked in New York and worked for a nonprofit about the language of law, and this 3-hour debate about the word "and" in a UN resolution.
I've heard about this debate.
Yeah. It changed, the word "and" changed how these sovereign nations, what they were obligated to do in Sudan. It was about Darfur at the time. And I was riveted by this. And she listened to my story and was like, that's kind of dumb. I was like, all right, I'm in the right field. She's in the right field. But I think about that when I'm dealing with contracts and dealing with how contracts set expectations for both parties in general, but certainly in this work, and particularly because doulas, we're not a new profession, we're kind of new, air quotes, new, or maybe for quote unquote that type of parent, or the different cultures in the different cities and areas we work in. And so the expectations can shift and change depending on where we are and folks' expectations of us and their expectations about pregnancy and childbirth and postpartum. And so a contract for a doula is a good way of introducing the language of the type of work we do, so the scope of our practice. When I'm working with doulas on contract writing, I hammer this in over and over and over again. If you don't have the scope of practice in your contract, what good is your contract? Sure, you can have stuff about deposits and fees, but the scope is the most important thing in terms of protecting yourself. But then it's also a really great way of starting that conversation with the clients and potential clients about what do I do, what don't I do. and both in the broad sense of what is a doula and down to the nitty gritty of this is my practice and this is what my practice looks like. And being able to start those conversations in the interview process too can help families make a good decision about who to work with. Because you might get someone, you have certain expectations of what a doula does or what you need because of your particular pregnancy experience or your particular care provider or your particular emotional state because of cultural influences or something particular that's going on with your family, and being able to know the comfort level of that particular doula and what she provides in her practice is certainly talking about that, I think, is much more useful than that typical question that you see online to ask a doula about what's in her toolbox. What is your scope is a much better way of getting the useful information out of this person who might be part of the most intimate experience in your life so far.
Yeah. I understand that there are doulas who show up to interviews with a question for the potential client, which is, what would you like me to do for you?
Yeah.
Right. And that's a great question to ask. And I never do that. So using myself as an example, right? Like I don't do that. I show up ready to tell clients exactly what I do.
Yeah.
First.
Yeah.
Right. And that way, the contract is second to that, but the contract is an affirmation of that description of what's it going to look and feel like when I'm in your home as best I can describe it and what I will point myself at, how I'll point myself there and why.
Yeah.
Why? Because that's when you're actually describing scope of practice. If I say the reason I want to see you day one home from the hospital is because your body's going to be going through dramatic changes on that day. Right?
Yeah.
They're not going to wait until you're ready. They're going to be happening. They're going to look and feel somewhat like this. And I will address them thus.
Yes. Yeah, and it's you need to have that conversation, and it's really important to interview a couple of doulas. You might fall in love with one because of a website or feel like you want to get it done and hire people over the phone, which I almost never will accept. Being hired over the phone, even if you really like me, I want a good sense. And it's partly for me, it's partly for the doula to be able to spend time getting a sense of, will I be able to have a safe and satisfying practice and experience and contract negotiation with this person or this family so that I can stay not burnt out and enjoy this experience and enjoy my work and bring my best self to this person's very important experience. And even though contracts can be intimidating and doulas have contracts that are all over the yard because there isn't very good education about that. There isn't very good education about how to run a successful small business when you're trained as a doula, for good and bad. So it's nice to, as a family, looking and interviewing a couple different people and looking at the contracts and being able to see the differences in what exists out there and then being able to bring that to subsequent interviews or follow-up conversations with doulas. Especially, you go to your first interview and if you still aren't 100% sure what a doula is, what a doula does, or why you're doing this. You just heard it's a good idea, maybe.
Yeah.
Your sister had a doula and, said she couldn't have done it without it. She could have, but made the experience better. But the contract seems to be an afterthought for so many people, or that they're getting into the nitty-gritty about cancellations and fees and things, and not looking at how the contract reflects this person's practice and this person's communication style. And so that can be a really nice way of having another piece of documentation. And maybe you want someone who spells everything out in paper. Maybe you aren't totally turned off by the doula who has the 2-paragraph contract that says, I love babies, and I love working with babies and stuff. And it's like, now the contract is just a nice letter to somebody, which is sort of fine and sort of not. I remember seeing a lot of those contracts when I first started.
Loving babies isn't a scope of practice.
It's not a scope of practice. Put that on your website.
Yeah.
Keep it out of your contract.
Yeah.
So as, sometimes people get too in the weeds about things, and but that's a good sign for a doula too. If a family is coming in and wanting them to adjust certain things in their practice, that's a good red flag maybe for that doula to say, I'm not comfortable taking this on. Yeah. Like in my postpartum contract, I have an addendum that I don't work with any of those electrical gadgets, those sleep aids or sleep monitors, or and I won't plug anything into an app because I don't think they're safe, and I don't want to take that liability. And I've done the research to know that they're not good, and they increase postpartum depression. So if a family is dead set on working with their $1,200 snooza, they're free to do that when I'm not there. But
they can't ask you.
They can't ask me to do it
and be involved in it.
Yeah. And I make them sign something that says that, because that's important to me in my practice. I've had enough intense experiences around those things everyone was safe and fine, but it was an uncomfortable experience. And so just having that and moving forward with that in my practice was important. And it's important for parents to know that part of my practice too. So it's a two-way street. It's always a conversation. And these sort of official documents should always be seen as a conversation and not something overly intimidating.
That's so nicely put, because I was thinking as you were just saying that, Emily, that not only is the contract just a documented form of the conversation that you have had, that you're having now, and that is always open to some form of modification, right? Like there's no such thing as never a possibility for change.
It's a living document.
It's a living document. Yeah. It's part of, as you called it so beautifully, a conversation. But I think also the thing that I learned over these many, many years, and I've always worked with contracts, is it's a conversation I'm having with myself.
Oh, yeah.
As well. Yes. Just like you pointed out. It's like, I was asked to do something I never imagined doing, and realized that for my own comfort and safety, I needed to put a boundary around that thing.
Yep.
And it's going to show up in my contract, and it's going to sound like this. And if and when clients ask for a description of that, or perhaps in my interview beforehand, I'm going to make it clear why that's in my contract.
Yeah.
So again, just because it's written down doesn't mean it's dead. Right. Like you said, it's not dead. It's just a way to have a boundary that then, if necessary, can be negotiated. Yeah. Not all boundaries can be.
Yep.
And that's why we sign documents.
Yeah. And it can, and a lot of things with contracts we don't negotiate. So our terrible phone bill contracts, there's not room for negotiation. But more intimate one-on-one interpersonal things that we do. So everything from buying a house, marriage contracts, things like that, there is some negotiation. And so there is room, and you can go back and forth in email, you can do phone calls. I like to do in-person contract signings to just make sure that we're on the same page, and I might pop in and spend an extra 15 minutes with a couple going over that. And yeah, it's great. And we like learning from clients too. So don't feel as new parents too intimidated by that you're like telling us what to do or wagging your finger.
Yeah.
Look at it as a chance to ask questions and feel secure so that you don't feel like there's arguments later, especially you don't want to be negotiating things in a contract in the middle of labor or when the baby is there. Also, that's just not going to happen. At that point, we're good and we're going to show up and do our job and do the best we can in that. But like I had clients who over the summer who asked me, I didn't have anything specific about what if there was a loss of baby in the contract. I don't feel like I need to have that in my contract. I don't like putting that in my contract, but it was really important to them that I did. So I took that away with me, sat and wrote something that felt okay for me in the language that felt like they were getting what they needed to sign the contract. I felt like it wasn't something that I wasn't pushing the boundaries of my practice to make that accommodation for them. And I didn't add it to any of my other contracts. Yeah. And it was a 3-line addendum in there, and it made them feel good, and it made me feel good, and we had a great working relationship, and it never came up.
Yeah. You know, it makes me think about, and of course this is, you know, one of those subjects that sometimes I'm talking with clients about and sometimes I'm not. It's a good subject, but it's not always a place somebody can go, right? And so it's one of those ways that we have to be instinctive about how we're caring for clients before they're even our clients. Yeah. Sometimes. Yeah. But also I wanted to circle it around to, you know, it's often the case, a question comes up in interview with potential birth clients, and it's a good question. It's been one of those things that whether or not it has come up in advance, it still gets revisited in these particular cases. And the question is, you know, I see that you're on call for me. It's wonderful. And, you know, we're looking forward to whatever their idea of their birth trajectory is, natural childbirth. Let's just use that. That's an often used thing. But what if we have to have a C-section? Often potential clients are even more specific. What if we have to have a planned C-section? Yes. What do we need you for? Yeah. And of course I have an answer to that, what they might need me for. But it's the kind of tricky situation that comes up for doulas, because after all, it's important that clients understand that there's a limit to how many clients we can take in a given month, and therefore our income is limited. Yes. Right? We don't have endless opportunity to make the income that we're doing. So part of the understanding when a doula signs a contract is that she's made that time and space, which is way up in the air. Yeah. Right? She's made that time and space available for the client. Yeah. And we'll see to it that they will get the care in exchange for that payment. Yeah. And so it's a tricky question, because sometimes really in actuality these things come up and the clients really prefer to then manage that themselves essentially. Right? Which is fine. Yeah. What's not going to be fine for a doula is having to give up that income. Yeah. So it's just a good thing to think about. It would be a shame if clients therefore thought, well, I'm not even going to hire a birth doula because what if? Yeah. Right. What if I put out this money and then decide I don't want it? Well, people do that every day. They pay big money into insurance policies for other things. Oh, totally. Right? Yeah. And I'm not saying that a doula offers any sort of guarantees for outcome, but we do offer a kind of support, social emotional support, physical comfort support, etc. What we're offering, is something that we show up for, whatever the situation, to the best of our capacity. And so it's a funny, interesting, and very common eventuality. What's much more likely to happen statistically and in the world is that you're going to have the C-section that wasn't predicted in advance, wasn't planned. Your doula will have spent days at your side, and then you have a C-section. So, if we're looking at this as sort of a reality check, it's much more likely that your doula would have been with you a whole lot more. It would be a whole much less contained time frame that she would have spent with you if you then have a C-section.
Right.
And so, again, because we do our work on sort of a broad continuum of possibility, I think thinking of your doula as a resource rather than somebody who's going to be wedded to a tightly specific sort of screenplay idea of, like a birth plan, is a mistake. And therefore, all the more reason to think of it as a conversation.
Hey, fellow parents, can we take a moment to reflect on the joyous chaos that is parenthood? You know those days when our hearts swell with love at the sight of our little ones and we're bursting at the seams to share every adorable moment with the world. But let's be real. Some things are better kept in the family, and your loved ones who matter the most aren't always close by, and they might not be that tech-savvy either. So how can you easily share your baby's beautiful growth with loved ones while keeping your precious memories secure? I remember the frustration of trying to use some of the big tech photo solutions, only to find they fell short of what I needed. That's when I stumbled upon something truly remarkable, the Family Album app. The Family Album app was created to give parents a secure and easy way to share photos and videos with loved ones. It's an orderly and totally secure haven for your family's personal memories. I love that there's no third-party ads, no unwanted eyes, unlimited storage, and that it's totally free. So to all the parents who are out there still trying to use other messaging apps for your kids' photos, it's time to level up your family photo game with a free photo sharing app. Head over to the App Store today, search Family Album, one word, download the app, and start creating a legacy of love one photo at a time.
Exactly. And so that made me think of a handful of things. One is that if there's any doulas out here listening, you need to figure out what your parameters are around that eventuality, and you need to write that into your contract. And doulas can offer a lot of different things. It's also, as a doula, a good idea to set your deposit rate to be what, if you didn't get that second half or however you do your payment plans, that the deposit will get you through that month. So that's how I set my deposit. And then for parents to think about that deposit covered the interview, any resources and materials that the doula had, the time they spent with you, probably prenatally already. And then, a lot of times planned cesareans still happen fairly late on in pregnancy, and your doula might have still been on call for you for some time. And then likely, we hold our clients in us until we feel that the contract has ended or there's been some resolve, so that emotional and resource space that the doula is holding, and that we're probably going to contact you after your birth and see how you're doing and see if you need help. And knowing that you're paying, like the insurance idea, that you're paying to hold someone that you can text and call and email in the middle of the night during your recovery, or, when you come back from the hospital on day 5 and you suddenly feel alone, that you have this person who already held space for you and will continue to hold space for you. So we're not, you don't have a cesarean birth, and now because your plans have changed, you have yet another person that you feel like has changed expectations or, given up on you. So it's part of this conversation. Just is triggering a lot in my head about just how we talk about birth and risk and changes in birth in general, but that's a separate long podcast conversation about the language around that. But it's interesting because, we get to learn a lot about our clients or potential clients through the questions, the things that stand out to them in our contracts. Mm-hmm. And that one about the cesarean birth is really common, like you said. And sometimes when that conversation is coming up a lot, it's a red flag for me about, is their care very risk-based? Are they getting a lot of information already about how they might be walking down the plank to the eventual cesarean, and thinking about how, 1 in 3 births in the United States does wind up being a cesarean birth, major surgical birth. I'm not judging American parents for having that approach, but we can doulas, you can choose to either use that as a launching pad to talk about the care and talk about care provider and the space and what information have you been getting about your birth and why do you feel this risk? Why do you feel this the thing about, and then do you understand what I do as a doula? Mm-hmm. So you can, this can actually open up a lot of avenues, which then after that conversation should give both parties a better sense of the what they might want, expectations, and the philosophy around these things. So instead of seeing that as a scary part, see it as a really beautiful open door for a conversation that might change everybody's experience overall. And for doulas too, thinking about maybe putting in there something about, I'll do a few more postpartum visits or
what are you willing to offer should your client need to shift where her care goes, right? I mean,
same with
what does that look like?
Same with if it was a transfer, a home birth transfer or a birth center transfer. And doulas, you can figure out how much of that you want to put in your contract or not. There's also being able to have separate sheets where you talk about those eventualities that parents just have in advance that they can feel free to look at or not look at, because that's something that comes up a lot with, home birth center supported births. What happens if we transfer? What does that look like? Yeah. So it's a lot of different situations. But it can be I think it's a really cool opportunity for parents to be like, I've never even thought of that. Or I was focusing so much on this one thing that now this conversation has opened up a lot of other doors. And getting the different responses from different doulas should help you make up your mind about, I like their approach to problem solving, or I like that package exists, or that they have that experience, or this is what makes me feel like they're really on my side through this process. So it can be a really beautiful gift to have an anxiety about a portion of the contract, I guess is what I'm going with.
Yeah, well, and as often as not, the phrase C-section comes up because, and let me just say, the naturally naive first-time mother is very likely to have heard out in the world that doulas reduce, right? And this is how they hear it. Yeah. Doulas reduce C-sections, the risk of C-sections. Unnecessary. The word unnecessary goes out the window. It's just like all C-sections. Right. If I have a doula, I'm less likely to have one. Well, that's a nuanced conversation as well, right? Yes. You don't have to feel like a potential target of a C-section, right? But let's stay reality-based. Just because you have a doula doesn't mean you won't have a C-section. Yeah. And your doula is going to be your social emotional support and resource guide once you have that contract to help you navigate what's your relationship to this actual process, which is what getting pregnant starts you off on. It's a process,
if you had a super healthy pregnancy with a home birth midwife, you still have a 3% chance of having a cesarean. So there's nothing you can do that chucks that out the window. So it's worth thinking about and talking about, but again, can open up a lot of doors for bigger, maybe less stressful conversation too. But on that point, one of the things that I really love about working with doulas with the contracts in various ways is reinforcing this idea of talking to clients about how we're not these tokens or magical talismans that save people from things. Like, I just need to show up with my doula shield, and they're somehow going to fight the staff, and they're going to physically body check. I mean, I have wanted to. I do not do that. I have not smacked anything out of a doctor's hand, though it's been tempting. Sure. I stay within my scope as a non-clinical provider. And at a certain point, we wind up being, for better or worse, a low person on the totem pole in the decision-making process in a birth to a certain extent. So,
and yet what we do provide, which I hope is a form of social emotional support in those moments, that helps them, whether it's helping them navigate the language the doctor used, because that, for somebody who didn't quite get what they just heard, that's a huge moment, right? This is why they're talking to me about that. If it's, I see that you're confused. I'm witnessing you and noticing that there might be some anger here or some grief in this moment. And you have a moment to have that grief.
Oh, absolutely.
However, the doula can show up and be first the witness and second the social emotional support in that witnessing. Can be huge, because after all, the reality check on why doulas make a difference is that it's the sense of satisfaction at the end of the journey that is experienced by the birth givers. That is really why doulas are out there.
Totally.
Right? It's like, I felt I understood at the time and understand my journey on a level that I can't imagine being able to without that form of support.
And it's that nuanced conversation of that's one of the big things that lowers interventions is that time and that space. I think a lot of new parents, and this comes up pretty clearly in interviews when they ask about, I get the common question of how do I interact with staff, which is also something I have in a scope of practice, that I don't speak for you and that I'm not speaking to the staff on your behalf on, clinical things beyond they ask, when was the last time you peed and ate and things like that. Like, I can answer that, sure. That conversation really helps me talk about those nuanced things in our scope and how doulas are there to be that continuity of care that's missing in that gap and that full satisfaction place, and being able to hit on some of those notes of we make birth safer, which looks a lot of different ways for different people beyond this kind of triggered words of cesarean birth or
whether or not your body will be safe.
Right.
There, I think a feeling of safety is an emotional.
Yes. Yeah.
Because experience, it's a somatic experience.
It's regardless of the outcome. And so I use my contract too as a way to, in the interviews, talk about that. Like, my fee doesn't change based on your outcome. Because the outcome is very likely going to be healthy mom and healthy baby. So getting more into the weeds of the outcome of, did you have an epidural? Did you have a cesarean birth? Did you have an induction? Things like that doesn't change. I don't get gold stars. I don't get paid more if you have an unmedicated vaginal birth. I don't get bragging rights. I get to feel like I'm useful and contributed to you if at the end of whatever your experience was, you felt like you had someone on your side, you got the best birth you could have with whatever physiological happenstance occurred on the day of your labor, that you feel like you weren't disrespected or bullied, or, because normally people are expecting, I think, to be yelled at in the birth space. Like, we're doing this now, and have it be dramatic. But it normally comes with a very nice resident squatting next to your bed and telling you that this is just what they're going to do now without a reason. And folks that don't have a doula or don't understand what a doula's role is as kind of the interpreter and the space creator might think that we're there to do something that's more blaring and obvious. Superhero. Yeah. Some kind of, I mean, I don't want to replace medical choreography with some kind of like quote unquote natural choreography or some kind of me taking over and having ego about my methodology or the thing that I know if you do these 10 steps, these are my 10 doula steps that will guarantee you a vaginal birth with no drugs. Like, that doesn't exist.
Perfect bliss.
Yeah.
Harmony.
Yeah. It's also not the point. You know, your process and journey through this experience and the satisfaction that you have, and when you're holding your baby, when you get home, and you're feeding your baby however you're going to feed your baby, and you're, you know, hunkered down wherever you're hunkered down with the people around you that you chose, that you feel good about your experience, or you feel like you have a safe space to process the things that weren't so good. And that's my job, whether or not you have 10 stitches in your perineum or a road brush kind of thing. You know, like, we're there to do whatever. Doulas are really about that adaptability and that flex and that like zoomed in, honed in focus on your experience. Yeah.
Well said. We're going to have to wrap up. Sadly, I never like wrapping up. I could go on for days talking about all these wonderful things. But Emily, why don't you give us your contact information so people know how to find you?
Yeah. You can find me at rosewoodconsult.com. And my contact information's on my website, but my email is probably the best way to get a hold of me from that. And it's just doula@rosewoodconsult.com.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. And why don't you tell us how you, I like how you describe your work on your website, having gone to your website. Do you want to just kind of give the overview of the work you do? Because
sure.
it extends beyond what I would call strictly doula.
Yeah. So I've just kind of branched out and started to formalize this idea of being a health consultant, because I think doulas do that, but I've gone and reached out and started to do more work with just well person, more like well woman care. I'm super interested in, like, my dream is to work with young women who are transitioning out of pediatric care into needing some gynecological support. So working with parents and, coming of age folks on finding good care, because too many people are traumatized by their first gynecological experiences and then just don't go back for their annual visits. And I hear too many of those stories, and it's pulled my heartstrings. Yeah. So there's that portion. I just work with all folks on that kind of hormonal education and nutritional support and finding great care providers, because it's really important who you work with. And then, so I've also extended that now. So doing more consultations with pregnant folks and new parents in that realm. And so beyond just having me on board and on deck and ready to go for the big day, is working with families earlier on to talk about those things about, how do I find a care provider? How do I find a doula? What is the difference between hospital A and hospital B, the birth center versus home birth? Trying to do a lot of postpartum prep consultations, because I work with families in postpartum a lot, and I was an infant care specialist in a daycare for a little bit. So working with slightly older babes in that realm and those transitions, and just parents are getting a lot of bad information in that vulnerable period. And so wanting to work with folks sooner in all these capacities and hopefully catching people before they have to deal with the, oh no, I thought my doctor would have told me something at week 35 and I'm still waiting. Mm-hmm. And so I better hire a doula. Mm-hmm. So that's my vision, is just catching people before they even start falling. Mm-hmm. Hopefully that'll improve everybody's experiences.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. Well, thanks, Emily, so much for coming over, having tea, and telling us all about it. I really, really appreciate it. And you gave us so much good food for thought, but also just straight talk about, why and how.
And if people,
really helpful.
I have something up on my blog about postpartum expectations. It's kind of an edited, slightly redacted version of the handout that I give to postpartum families.
Sweet.
That I wrote after kind of a bad experience, as a teaching experience of I need to put this in writing, but I would love for parents to check that out. And it's pretty applicable to birth folks looking for birth doulas as well. Yeah. It's about how those conversations can go and how putting that investment in of that longer interviews and longer chat time can really help you in the long run. And you'll have a better, ooey gooey, lovey, cool relationship with this person.
That sounds great. And we, if you like, will publish that on our site. Awesome. So people who are going right to the site, whether or not they've heard your interview yet, will see that. If that would be nice.
Thank you.
That'd be great.
Cool.
Okay, Emily. Well, thanks again.
Thanks, Esther.
Thanks everybody for tuning in and showing up for another episode. And take care in the meantime. Bye-bye.
You can subscribe to this podcast in order to hear more from us. Thank you for listening, everyone, and I hope you'll join us next time on the Fourth Trimester. The theme music on this podcast was created by Sean Trott. Hear more at soundcloud.com/Sean Trott. Special thanks to my true loves, my husband Ben, daughter Penelope, and baby girl Evelyn. Don't forget to share the Fourth Trimester Podcast with any new and expecting parents. I'm Sarah Trott. Goodbye for now.
Hello again, bicycle man. I know you're doing all that you can. I wrote the song, simple and true. I wrote the song, I'll sing a song for you. You got your wheels, you got your gears. You ride around town without any fear. You got your pedals, you got your brakes. You always wear your helmet for safety's sake. Hello again, bicycle man. I know you're doing all that you can. I wrote the song, simple and true. I wrote the song, I sing a song for you. Hello again, bicycle man. I know you're doing the best that you can. I wrote the song, simple and true. I wrote the song, I sing a song for you.